Probably the single biggest misconception about the Crusades was that they were actually a big deal in the Middle East. No, really. Now, Crusades as a concept of holy wars were important during the Middle Ages in Europe, but the Crusades as the conflict over the Holy Land specifically wasn't important. The most important Crusades were in fact the almost unknown Northern Crusades, the war against the pagans in the Baltic regions and in the north of the Scandinavian peninsula, and the Reconquista in Spain against the Muslim political entities that existed there. All of these crusades involved far more knights and had far more permanent effects on the history of their respective regions than the crusades in the Holy Land ever did. The crusades in the Holy Land were only able to conquer and control a few coastal enclaves, cities and villages, and only because the Middle East was in a state of complete anarchy and chaos due to the degradation and decay that happened in the wake of the decline of the Fatimid Caliphate and the nomadic Turkic and later Mongolian invasions, which caused chaos and prevented any organized opposition to the Crusades in that small area of the Middle East where they had managed to get a foothold. The control of major urban centers was never able to be sustained by the Crusaders, and Jerusalem, after having been conquered by the Crusaders, was lost within 90 years, with the rest of the history of the Crusaders in the Holy Land consisting of failed attempts at retaking the city, while steadily losing more ground, and all this despite the fact that the Islamic world was constantly being devastated in this period by Eastern nomadic invaders and the strife between various Islamic sects and subgroups, duking it out in the form of various political entities waging wars against each other. The Crusades in the Holy Land mattered more in Western Europe as a set of myths or as an idolized ideal than in terms of the actual events and political ramifications that occurred due to the Crusades in the Holy Land. The Crusades for the Holy Land were mainly notable because of how romanticized they were by people at the time and by later periods, with poems and stories being written about it and mystifying the Holy Land and the Crusades in order to take the Holy Land. Probably due to the fact that it was easier to mystify the Holy Land, the birthplace of Jesus Christ, than it was to mystify a lot of the other areas where Crusaders were present. For example, the Iberian Peninsula was too close by and often in an extremely complex political situation, with a lot of cross-alliances and infighting between various Christian groups and Islamic groups that sometimes allied across religious lines against their enemies of the same religion. The north of the Scandinavian peninsula and the Baltics were in Northern Europe and not all that different from where many of the Crusaders themselves came from, and home to uncivilized barbarian pagans that were beneath the more civilized Christians, while in the Holy Land was home to the holy sites of Christendom, and to the great and powerful Islamic realms, the most civilized and powerful parts of the known world at that time, bordered by the remains of the once great and respected Roman Empire, that many of the Western and Northern European Crusaders still saw themselves as living in the shadow of. Due to the more advanced nature of the realms in the Middle East, they presented a far more worthy foe that you could get glory from fighting against, by proving your own courage and might, and faith in the Christian God. For most Europeans, the Holy Land was far away from their own home, both in distance and in terms of environment, making it an interesting and exotic setting for their epic poetry and their tales of glory and valor. So the Crusades in the Holy Land were pretty much valued highly during the Middle Ages. However, the fact of the matter is that after the Middle Ages, the Crusades, almost all of them, were pretty much forgotten in the sands of time, as the people of the Renaissance and the later Enlightenment viewed the Middle Ages as a terrible time, best forgotten and ignored due to its terrible, backwards nature, and had no respect for the mythology of chivalry and the accompanying stories about the Crusades in the Holy Land. But later, during the Victorian era, when the nations of Europe were developing their own national myths and stories and started looking to romanticize the Middle Ages as a great background for the myths about their great nations, Crusades came back, yet the Victorian people were a bit haphazard and rather mixed in their views about it, inheriting a negative view of the era of the Crusades from the Enlightenment, which is why popular culture today simultaneously sees the Crusades as chivalrous knights fighting for true Christian faith without doing any true evil at all and acting almost saint-like in the Holy Land,
and as savage religious fanatics running around massacring everything in sight in increasingly barbarous ways.
While the Crusades did commit massacres, they were pretty much par for the course for the time by the rules of warfare during that era. And the really brutal massacres of the Crusades were actually to be found in Eastern and Northern Europe, not in the Holy Land. A view more close to reality would be that the Crusaders were a group not that different from most people at this time, fighting for their religion, such as the Crusaders' Muslim counterparts waging jihad in the Middle East. And speaking about the Middle East, the Crusades in the Holy Land were even less of a big deal in the Middle East than they were in Europe. And by the time the Europeans returned to colonize the Middle East in the late 19th century, the Crusades had pretty much been forgotten outside of the Levantine coastal area, the only part of the Middle East that the Crusaders had been able to establish a presence in. And even there, it wasn't a major part of folk memory. The great medieval person from this era that the Arabs of the Middle East remembered wasn't Saladin, who had shattered Crusader power, but it was Baybars, the Mamluk, who stopped the near unstoppable Mongol advance of destruction and mass slaughter throughout the Middle East. And Saladin, when he was remembered, was more due to him overtaking the Shia Fatimid Caliphate and converting Egypt from Ismaili Shia Islam to Sunni Islam as his great achievement. The myth of the powerful and barbaric Crusaders that the Western Europeans had developed was actually reintroduced into the Middle East or recreated there, where it was appropriated for the purposes of developing an Arab anti-colonial nationalist narrative. The Crusaders were remade into a conflict between Europeans and Arabs as a precursor to the modern colonial conflicts against the rule of the British and French empires over the Middle East. In medieval Arabic sources, the Crusaders were just seen as raiders, bandits and a nuisance rather than a real potent threat. The Crusades in the Holy Land were also not an ethnic conflict between a united Europe against a united Arabic Islamic world, but a religious one, and even then, neither side was united into a cohesive, united entity. The Crusaders came, for example, from many parts of Europe. Though French was the main language used during the Crusades in the Holy Land, there existed Germans, Slavs, Italians and Nordic peoples as well, many of whom came from lands that had been in conflict with each other, and that carried these conflicts over into the Crusades. Christians were oftentimes on the receiving end of the Crusades as well. The Crusades sacked Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom at the time. The Teutonic Knights, the main holy order of the Northern Crusades, spent most of its history fighting Slavic Christians, and there were crusades waged against Christian heretics in Western Europe as well. And Christian minorities not of the Western Roman Catholic Church in the Holy Land were often massacred and greatly suppressed by the Crusaders. The Crusaders even had conflicts among themselves at times when it came to various issues, going back to issues in Europe. The Crusades were not modern united Europeans trying to create a nation state, but rather a hodgepodge of various religious Catholic groups and various familial clan interests, and political interests that were often in conflict with each other. Meanwhile, many of the warriors of the Islamic Middle East at this time weren't Arabs, but Turkic peoples, Berbers and other minorities. Saladin, for example, was a Kurd, a people that speak a language that has more in common with most European languages, such as English, than with Arabic. and there existed a lot of conflicts between various Muslim political entities, where the Crusades were at most a minor issue, being confined to a relatively small, unimportant area, and not a great power in the struggles between the larger entities of the Middle East. The Middle Eastern Islamic world at this time also had much larger issues to deal with than the Crusaders. Mainly the fact that the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, that had been the dominant force in the Middle East for centuries, had more or less collapsed, and the entire region was being taken over by various smaller entities and by one large entity, the Ismaili Shia Fatimid Caliphate, which in turn, when the Crusades began, was beginning to collapse itself due to various warring factions within it. And you also had nomadic invasions by Turkic peoples, such as the Seljuk Empire and later Mongols, which brought great devastation and often introduced a lot of new practices and ways of life, which caused conflict and strife. This led to crises of faith and politics and bitter conflicts in much of the Muslim Near East, with the Crusades being a slight nuisance next to these greater issues and calamities. And when it seemed like things were calming down for the Middle East, their new nomadic Turkic invaders were beginning to become settled, civilized Muslims and speak proper languages for Islamic rulers, such as Persian or Arabic, and the Western barbarians on the Levantine coast, i.e. the Crusaders, were suffering defeat after defeat and would soon be gone. It was at this time that the worst calamity would occur, as the Mongols arrived, and they would unleash a devastation that the Muslim world had never before experienced, and their death toll
would be in the many millions of souls sent to an early grave.
In short, for your average Middle Easterner living in the region during this time, the nomadic invasions of the Turks and the Mongols and the wars of the other Islamic political entities were the greatest threats to civilization, the destroyers of the world. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were a minor issue. One was weak, far away from home, as they were more or less confined to this little small area of the Levant, less advanced and could easily be dealt with once the greater threats were dealt with. The Crusaders only survived because of other greater conflicts around them, making them not the focus of the efforts needed to take them out permanently. One of the reasons as for why Saladin had to make peace with the Crusaders was that he was involved in a lot of other conflicts, particularly quelling Shia Ismaili uprisings in Egypt, and due to a prolonged conflict he had in Yemen, which brought enormous costs upon his treasury, much more than the Crusades had ever done. And for most of the history of the Crusades, the Crusaders controlled little more than a little bit of an area around the port city of Acre, and were tolerated there as traders and occasional allies in the various conflicts of the Middle East, and because it was inconvenient to take such a well-fortified area. The Crusaders never truly succeeded in expanding beyond Acre, with most of their gains being quickly lost again, as they then became a threat and thus needed to be responded to once other threats had disappeared, such as the Ismaili Shia Fatimids falling due to Saladin, or the Mongols being defeated by the later Mamluk Baybars. The last Crusader strongholds days were numbered, as their settlements and fortresses fell one by one in a side campaign conducted by the Mamluks in the Mamluk-Mongol War in revenge for the Crusaders siding with the Mongols. And the last fortress, Acre, was taken in 1291. In other words, the Crusades were finished in the Middle East due to being part of a side conflict, a minor part in a greater conflict, and not even part of the main part in a conflict. The Crusaders in the Holy Land, being a minor entity, always siding with one side against another in the various conflicts of the Middle East, had finally come to an end, in a rather unimportant side campaign that demonstrates just how unimportant the Crusades truly were among the giants of the Middle East. And my viewers, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please post any comments or questions in the comment section. I'd love to interact with you.
Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.